I say we dive in and then we'll people kind of jump in as they can over the lunch break.
Sure.
Hey everybody, and welcome to the Courageous Minds Only community. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jason Hauer, co-founder and chief growth officer at the Garage Group and founder of the Courageous Minds Only community. And for those of you who don't know the Garage Group, we help big companies operate like startups against their tough innovation and growth challenges. And we created the Courageous Minds Only community really as a place for leaders to come together to get inspiration and ideas for solving just kind of big uncertain challenges in an uncertain world. And it impacted thousands of leaders in Chicago and New York and now all over the world virtually through Zoom. So just excited that you're here and excited for a great conversation. Brigette Wolf, I've gotten to know her over the years, is just a fantastic leader, and her and kind of SnackFutures have an amazing story. So excited to dig into that. Before we do, if you have attended CMO chats in the past, you hear this from me, like, this is to me such an important conversation and an important time to get inspired, to kind of grab ideas and take them and apply them, whether to ourselves, to our brands and our businesses. So I would just encourage you, one, put your phone down, close your email and kind of lock into the conversation. But two, commit to yourself to take something out of this conversation and actually apply it. So just encouragement there. We'll have about 45 minutes of conversation and then dive into Q&A, but because it's more of a fireside chat, if you have questions, please ask them as we go and I'll try to weave them in, but I would love for you guys to bring up some really strong questions as we go forward. So sound good? Awesome. Well, let's dive in. Brigette, just so everybody can kind of get to know you a bit, would just love to hear more about kind of your background and your path to SnackFutures. And I'll ask it because I ask everybody, but then I'd love to hear about a time in your career, and I'll remind you if you don't share, but that you had to be courageous, whether it's launching a new idea, taking a new role, launching a new business, etc. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, pleasure. And, thank you for having me. And as Jason said with the chat, if you're not getting out of it what you were hoping for, make sure you ask the question before you leave. So we do. I'm thrilled to be here. I lead our global team of SnackFutures at Mondelēz International, which, if folks aren't familiar with Mondelēz, we are one of the largest snacking companies with the likes of brands of Oreo and Trident and Cadbury. And I like to say that SnackFutures is the nose of the dog. People talk about the tail, but we are actually the nose at the front of it, leading the future and where we want to be. I grew up, I was an investment banker in a prior life, and then I joined CPG. So I'm a classically trained CPG corporate marketer. Maybe that will be important as we get into this. And you have done different roles throughout base businesses and channel businesses and different brands, joining into the global team where eventually got into innovation. And ultimately now, as we created SnackFutures and architecting that, and now leading that team for the past couple of years. So.
Yeah. And when have you had to lean into courage throughout your career? What's a defining moment for you there?
I would say there's two, and whether it's courageous is sometimes just really leaning into now of fighting for what we believe in and having kind of to have the courage in your career to say, I can do this and move forward, to take some leaps of faith of where you're going to go in the unknown. And we kind of joke that everything we do in SnackFutures itself is an experiment, and experiments within that. I would say a different point in my life too was canceling a project. It is hard to say something's not working and we need to bury it and let go. And so I realized several years ago we were working on something and we just could not crack it. We couldn't figure out how to match a technological explanation with the consumer need, and we realized we had to go down another path. And I think being able to shut down something is often just as hard, or takes as much courage to say, no, we're not going to keep going down that route anymore, as much as we are is going towards something.
Digging into SnackFutures, I remember like you and I connected years ago at the Front End Innovation Conference when you were first launching SnackFutures, and big vision. And I think a lot of leaders in your shoes, maybe companies have changed strategy multiple times, and maybe their groups doesn't exist anymore. But I think as I think about SnackFutures, I think best in class in food and bev, but just a really great shining example of just new venture development in general for a business, right? And So for those of the audience that don't know SnackFutures, share what you guys are up to, what the focus, but I'd love to dig into the initial vision that you and the company had for it, but then how it's kind of morphed and changed as you've learned, as the market has changed, et cetera.
Yeah. So SnackFutures as context, we call ourselves an independent innovation and venture hub. We had two big pillars of work that we started with. One was to think and behave like startups. So that was an incredible kind of foundational piece. So we have kind of my shrine behind me of how are you going to invent the next generation of new brands and do it in a startup focused way, which much of what Jason's team does as a garage group actually inspired. I remember even having conversations of how can startups how are they resourceful in the networks and the people that they can connect with when they do research, that who can you lean into, and behaving that way. And we embrace that all the time of putting on an entrepreneurial hat to say, if I didn't have all the resources, and assume you don't, who would you go to ask these questions to? How would you get something done? How would you learn? The other pillar that we had was around venture. So investing in the next generation of entrepreneurs and partnerships and capabilities. Our vision at its the kind of easiest level was to disrupt snacking and to bring the next generation of well-being brands. And so that was probably the first piece, was we knew to be in an area that was incremental to the core of the business was going to be really important. So well-being was a very clear white space for us to go into. The other piece was we've evolved where we used to say we would invent, reinvent, and invest. The reinvent, we had done some work there, and then we realized, what, we're best letting the businesses tinker with their plants and their lines. And where our superpower is really in the new frontier. So we handed over whatever work we had done and completed to them to run. And then what we filled was a different pillar called Amplify, which was all the work that we've done in learning of our culture, the capabilities, the new tools, new partners. How do we amplify that and codify it to the organization? And now that we've been doing it for a little bit, we've got this new ecosystem and we want to do venture, how do we expand and deepen our relationships with startups? We've launched Codelab this year, which is our first startup engagement program. So it's really this vision about a dynamic portfolio of well-being brands and capabilities that we can continue to bring to life, whether it's by creating them or by partnering and helping accelerate them and grow them for the organization. And then, who knows, now we're even learning, we can teach the organization how to move with incredible speed and a little bit less weight than they're probably ever used to.
I'm excited to dig into Codelab, but before we dive in, give us a flavor in terms of the brands and the companies that you have in the SnackFutures portfolio.
Yeah, we have 5 in market right now. I'll go backwards. So you asked about also strategic piece. Our thing was well-being. We created a strategic game board, which are kind of areas really broad, like next generation of fruit and veg, or gut health, or planet first snacks. And we have worked against those. So in France, we have a brand called No-Coate, which is a carbon compensating brand. The product itself is an aperitif cracker for basically conscious-minded millennials. If you think of this social occasion where you're going to get together and have your cheese, wine, and crackers, all of these products are carbon neutral. They're locally sourced and manufactured. And we have actually an external carbon expert who calculates it all, and anything residual we compensate for. In the US, we have a plant-based snack or veggie snacking called Dirt Kitchen. So Dirt Kitchen Snacks has 2 lines. There's a veggie and nut, kind of like a trail mix, but culinary mix of the two. And then there's Veggie Crisp. So this is really a way of making vegetables snackably delicious, both accessible and convenient, but also really delicious and taking that culinary spin. We have a brand called Kapow, which takes the power of cacao fruit. So if anyone knows chocolate, and for our company, we're one of the largest manufacturers of chocolate, the cacao fruit looks like a football. It's this multicolored, beautiful fruit, but it's a fruit. And when we take the seeds out and beans to roast those for chocolate, the rest of the fruit, about 70%, gets wasted in the field. So we saw an opportunity to reimagine what you can do with that fruit. There's nutrition in there. There's delicious, tangy sweetness in there. So we've got Capel as a brand selling. We recently launched and we're testing milligram snacks, which is a nut butter with functional mushrooms. So it's something on a space of self-care and ready-to-eat functional snacking. And then lastly, we have Ruckus & Co., which is our kids empowerment. Our starting line was a frozen fruit smoothie that we launched and we're working through. And then we've got a couple in the pipe.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And my next question is kind of a little bit of a hybrid. Like I think like I shared before, I think SnackFutures is best in class. You guys have been very successful to date. I think one of the things I've admired about you and your leadership is the external, I'm sure you do it with your team too, but the external vision casting in terms of what you're trying to do. You actually are out there putting the work in terms of podcasts and videos, and you're constantly on social. You're just super passionate about what you're doing. Like that's just evident. And so I see that as very much like kind of a driver of success. But I'm curious, like, what do you feel like from your personal leadership where you've learned and grown to enable the success, but also just the more the how to win side of the strategy in terms of the enablers that have enabled you guys to be successful? Like, can you share some of that?
Yeah, I think some of it has been, we're passionate from the beginning in setting up SnackFutures, and we took this pause of like the mantra that we created was good for people, kind to the planet, deliciously fun. So I think it's a personal passion of being able to give consumers more choice. It's afforded me the ability to, I use this term a lot, but you have to fight for innovation. You fight for what's right and what's difficult to address certain things or to keep things going. And so as a personal space of, I love being able to have more of our portfolio, have choices. I would say it's taught me the past couple of years of really allowing your teams to, we always talk about consumer centricity, but allowing those who are truly close to the consumer and the project to hold their focus and own it and be able to make decisions. So someone had said to me that the more comfortable you are in your skin as a leader, and you will see this, and then it's where I try to emulate is you don't cling to power, you release it, and then everyone's grows and their knowledge base grows. And so I have found that when I can hover higher, I have a broader view of what's going on in the marketplace and the ecosystems. My team can be more resilient and responsive to what's going on. I'm reading it with the social media. I read a lot more now. It's just fascinating to have this level of curiosity of what's going on in the world, what's coming. I don't have the visionary of certain people like the Elon Musk who can just visualize a universe that's so radically different. But there is something about humanizing, particularly in food, of just looking around the world and not talking about consumers as consumers even, right? Talking to them about as human beings and people is how do they live their lives? How do you observe? How do you take some reality checks? And I think that's where we're also being successful is there's some like really funky stuff that you can do packaging or food tech. And at the end of the day, you're like, would you eat this? Would you carry it this way? Would you open the packaging like that? And would you store it? Like, this is not, so I always love to bring it back to a reality of very much of a user experience and who's going to eat this and what's really going on in their lives and having that understanding.
Got it. I think the other thing, I think even from a garage group perspective is when we see groups like yours, I think that the ones that we see are successful are very focused from a strategic perspective and they stay the course. The teams that aren't are kind of all over the place in terms of what they're trying to solve for and how they get the work done, and funding every year is kind of in question. And so can you just talk about maybe more what's enabled you guys to have that staying power, both in kind of the importance of strategic clarity and then just even the commitment from leadership and all that good stuff?
I would say being explicit up front, what is the remit of what we are and what we're not, how long it's going to take, setting some very clear expectations that not everything will work. We don't know what we're doing in all cases. We're building, we're laying those railroad tracks until having a set expectation that we need a level of flexibility, that we're not going to be so rigid in what we said is what you're going to see in 6 months. Even within projects, we are very clear of The early prototypes may look nothing. The concepts may be nothing that what ultimately goes to market, to allow that fluidity and iteration. For SnackFutures as an entity, it was how we would have a level of independence, which has enabled us to make decisions and be clear. I was mentioning we have a strategic game board of where our focus is. At a macro level, it's well-being and it's incremental. So we know we're not playing in certain lanes of where our brands are and going up against them. It's to be complementary. It's not to interfere with that day-to-day business. So that also allows us a way of operating outside. And then within projects, once you're there, kind of being laser focused of who are we serving and why, and not letting the noise come in. And I was joking earlier, right? Like taking machetes to certain ideations, and someone's like, "What about this or that?" It's really letting the team be very clear of their pivots are when they're ready to do it. It's not a pivot because some senior manager said you need to go over here. I think it should look like this.
Yeah, I love that. In terms of using kind of the you guys are the nose of the dog in terms of what's next, right? There's so many, obviously we can get into like kind of what happened with COVID and all that, but there's just so many emergent possibilities in terms of just consumer benefit, et cetera, right? Like how do you separate brands and concepts and ideas that you believe are going to have long kind of lasting impact for the business versus something that's maybe a fad? Like how do you are there things that you look for, or like how do you balance that?
Again, I think it's a question of, is there a consumer base there enough where the need is deep enough? I mean, we've talked in the past, take an obvious one that's now mainstream, right? The protein, but you could take even gut health as an area. For years in the yogurt area, everyone talked about probiotics, but the gut health in the prebiotic space is emerging. And I think as a long-term play of our health, and as we understand more in science and things become more commonplace understanding and not so complicated, that we'll see that emerging. I mean, there's always a different style diet, but for some people, there's real long-lasting health benefits there. I think the discovery around different types of functionality ingredients, partly because we're seeing seismic disruptions with what's going on with climate change to our food supply, that unearthing and discovering new sources of food, forget about functionality, might just be a bit of a survival piece at some point, or how we become better at farming. And so I think that's where it actually becomes interesting to see, is like, where is there a long-term piece? I mean, there's sometimes the fashion things. I mean, we talk about mushrooms. A couple of years ago, we were hearing rumblings. Now you're starting to see more inklings, and hopefully it will become a wave. But you don't always know. I mean, there's, we would joke last week was Expo West. We would have all walked up and down and seen, the 15 popcorns and the 62 turmerics and of the years past. And when CBD came in, some of them are fad pops, but some of them, if they're serving long-term needs of consumers, whether it's a convenience or a know-how, like I'm not a great cook, but if someone can help me on a culinary experience, I'm very open to that. And just kind of helping the consumer along is the piece.
Yeah. I think everybody on this kind of Zoom has some level of responsibility for pushing their organizations forward. And I'm curious, like, you have amazing context and understanding in terms of like where the market is going from a consumer perspective, emergent possibilities, just different ways then. Like how, just as an example for others, like how have you built that context? Are there, like you had mentioned Expo West, but like what are some of the disciplines and things that you've done over the years to really help you kind of just enable your almost gut level decision making, but it's based on a lot of inputs.
Yeah, it's funny, you watch almost for signals in the marketplace. So it's not just one place. I mean, Expo West is a wonderful example of like when it comes to life in 3D, but it's sometimes just paying attention to what's being talked about in small ways. And like, you'll hear about different exercises that start coming on. The mindfulness piece was in the works for a long time, as people would started with the yoga, and then they start working on mindful breathing, and then you get into like when there's a real mental health crisis. So I think it's just sometimes knowing, like, don't just let the stuff go past you, but as you see it, kind of be like, all right, that's an interesting deposit on that that topic. And then you see it again, like it keeps coming back in different areas, or you'll hear it like we talk to our international teams and we'll be like, what's going on in their markets? And I have a global team. So it's just sometimes sharing, hey, have you seen this new product? Networking and talking to people a lot of what's going on. And we have a huge insights team too that does foresight work for us. And so you see things that are rumbling, and then you've got proof points of examples of who's doing it, and then you see it again in another place. I think that's kind of the worst thing that happens for corporate marketers, business people is, right, we say this all the time, is they stay in their office, right? Like you're in your like get out. Like it used to be like, you do not need permission, but if you need it explicitly, I'm giving you, get out of your office, go to the grocery store, go see what's popping up in different stores. Years ago, we said, watch the menus, go see what's happening in menu development. Interesting, go look at candle stores, go see where the flavors and fragrances are tuning into, and kind of all those other almost Medici effect things of where it's colliding, of where is society and the next thing moving into.
Yeah, that's great. Let's change topics a little bit here and get it. You had mentioned Codelab before. I think it's super interesting, but would love like kind of the backstory of like why you guys decided kind of this is the year to kick it off, like how it works, like what are the benefits to SnackFutures of doing something like this? So.
Like so many things, it's build, learn, iterate, build, learn, iterate. And where we first started in SnackFutures was we knew we had been engaging and talking with startups because we wanted inspiration from them. Is how do they do what we want to do, and that sometimes is being really fast and nimble and agile and responsive and aware of what's going on. So we had been engaging with the startup community partly to learn and then grow. And then, as I said, on the venture side, we had started doing investments. So Uplift Food, which is a prebiotic gut health company, was one of our first investments. We then went to Hue, which became a full acquisition, and we've had a third. So kind of that investment. So as we were kind of building that, and we were building the innovation skills and system there, it was like, okay, how do we bring this to the next level? And we were hearing from a lot of the startup community, particularly during COVID, we had been wanting to explore what could we do as different types of programs. We had done pitch competitions in different areas, but what could we do that was a little bit more deliberate? And we are very much about having intention in what we do and having it done in a really personal, human way. And so that meant too that as a corporate going out to the startup community, how we were going to show up was really critical and had to fit with who we are and kind of the way that we want to work and partner with them. So we had started working on the genesis of Codelab earlier. And then when COVID hit, it was very clear that there was a need for help. There's always a need and a wish for corporate partnerships, but even in how we were developing it, we now had a better understanding and empathy and frankly, partners that could help them, not just at the Mondelēz scale, which as they aspire to get there, we can teach them and show them what does that look like, but we can meet them where they are today and we understand it. So it's been a really nice piece that, if you asked me 2 years ago, I don't think we could do the program that we're doing today back then. Like we could have just put together one, but it would not have the richness and the depth of understanding of the progression, and to be able to benefit also as a company, like as a corporate, like we can benefit now so much more because we can ask better questions. We now understand where the pain points are more than ever. And then the last piece we'll do with the program. So it's a 12-week curriculum that we have. Our first cohort has 9 startups in it. We'll be doing a showcase, COVID God willing, in person, that we will be able to give them a bit of a mini expo and an opportunity for people to meet them and see them.
Very cool. And then obviously I could assume are you guys taking equity in any of these, or is it just more an opportunity for?
Yeah, it's just an opportunity. We are giving them a $20,000 grant when it's over, but there is no equity stake. And our intention is that as these companies grow, because some of them are still very early days, and then they look to financing and they look to investors or partners or M&A exits, that they'll come to us. Oh, and you never know. Everyone's a relationship away from somebody else who has a capability that Mondelēz is looking for, or is the next business that would be a great fit. And I'll tell you, we are in an M&A mode right now, so it's a good time.
And in terms of I assume in terms of the submissions, in terms of getting down to the 12, like there's a lot of insight gathered from that process as well. Is that correct?
Tons. You see themes of, the number of, whether it's certain types of beverage or functional foods, or we talk about, there's both the what and the how. There's the categories themselves that were emerging. There was the different needs that we saw coming through. And sometimes you're like, wow, that's really fascinating. Doesn't fit into our space, but really cool.
Yeah.
So it gives us a window into what's happening too.
I have a couple more questions, but then would love to hear from kind of everybody on the Zoom. So if you have questions, throw them in the chat or start to think about kind of what are some of the other things you'd love for me to ask Brigette. I think let's shift to COVID. I think our last kind of in-depth catch up, we were talking about kind of the impact of COVID, and you guys were doing some interesting things, but you just highlight kind of impact on strategy, staffing. I think as I was even talking to our team, I think there was a couple of questions from our team in terms of what changed in terms of how you work, tools you use that maybe you're going to carry forward even as things kind of go back to a somewhat new normal. But just curious, how did COVID impact you, and how did it make you stronger? How did you change because of it?
So one, to your first question about strategic, it really forced me as a leader of what are the priorities? What are the things we absolutely must do right now? And what are the things that frankly, nice to have, needs to wait? And so I'll give a couple examples. One, we had just put Dirt Kitchen and Kapow into brick and mortar stores, and we were rolling those out in LA when March 17th came and everyone shut down, and we had all sorts of inventory, and we still needed to sell and needed to learn what was working with these bundles. And I would say within weeks, we learned how to set up D2C sites. We had the websites built, but they weren't built to be selling entities. And that was the very first pivot was, how quickly. So lesson one is build your site with the capability day one, so you don't have to struggle with that later. And you learn different things in the e-com world than you do in brick and mortar. So that was kind of an obvious but radical pivot right away. Then we had certain programs that we were needing to do consumer work with, that whether it was in-person focus groups or we had product and we had ideas. And it was March, April, was there is not a single human being that has the mental bandwidth or frankly the attention span to talk about what we wanted to talk about, the next genre of snacking in XYZ space. The only thing everyone heard about was COVID, and it still largely is, but it's slowly weaning off the mainstream conversation at the level that it was. And so we had to say, this not only isn't appropriate for us to start playing in new areas, it won't work. No one was ready for it. So we waited several months. And then the next piece was, great, people's mind space seemed to stabilize of what was going on with the shock of COVID and being home, but they're still not going out, and we still can't get them in a common area. So how do we think about digital and virtual groups and conversations? How do we mail things out differently and get approvals differently to send things to people's homes? Preparation is critical. The stimuli, I will say this, the stimuli you create always makes a difference. It is even more important when you're doing it virtually because, it's just a limited environment. So you want to be really thoughtful about what that stimuli is and what that conversation is and how long those conversations go. Mm-hmm. So that was there. And then other things, partly we would have delayed for managing our budget and resources, and part of it, the retailers made the decision for us. We were going to do some stuff in Colorado, and the stores were like, nope, can't be done. So we pushed out some of our soft launches and the test and learns to Q1 of this year, shifted states, shifted retail partners, which worked in our favor because it gave us time to think about a little bit more what we'd want to learn. But you really have to think about, what do you need? I'm sure with your team, it's we have all sorts of new tools, whether it's virtual or learning. You become very, selective and where am I really going to spend, right? Like anyone, if you think of startups with their cash burn, what's the most material thing I'm going to do that's going to make an impact? So you can do wonderful PR events or TV things, or wherever you're going to spend on your marketing. And all I want to know is it going to move one sale at all? And if not, like get closer to the store and go do something there. So we've become very disciplined in our choices of like what goes next and where do we have to make some tough choices.
Talk about the impact of like e-com and DTC as you go forward. Like, would you, obviously, like that wasn't as big of a part of the strategy out of the gate, but do you almost feel like that's a starting place now from the efficiency and the data learning perspective, or no?
Yeah, I think it gives you great learning and great flexibility in the beginning. And what we've heard is a lot of people say, right, COVID didn't change people's behavior, it accelerated their behavior. So what some people used to be doing and buying things on Shop Instagram or Facebook versus even going to a website and shopping, we talk about impulse purchases, right? Like you're not in store or you're on your phone, so you're not really buying at the checkout the impulse purchases you used to. I'll tell you, this phone, I'm buying all sorts of things on impulse. And so it's just a different way of learning. I would say you want to do them all. For us, we aren't rolling out nationally. So when you start in brick and mortar in one area, DTC is a great way to see where, if you're shipping everywhere, who's next, right? Like if we're in West LA, where is the next place that's ordering the most online? Because that would say there's a pull in that marketplace. So it helps you know where to go next. It also allows you to do a lot of A/B testing. You can play with pricing, you can play with messaging to see, if you have great learning partners, when are people leaving carts? How are they coming in? Which ads? So all of that becomes a really powerful learning piece. And I think as an initial marketer, it is a whole new world of social media and learning and awareness versus the kind of the traditional tools that we used to play with.
The one more question for me, and I think we can get into some of the Q&A. So you have questions, would love to hear them. Monica, thanks for kicking us off there. Kind of going forward, like what do you feel like innovation and growth leaders ought to be thinking about and kind of focusing on, and / kind of what's top of mind for you right now?
I think there's a bit of a long-term play. So there's how do you get to market quickly and learn, and then balancing the patience if some of this stuff is going to go. There is no overnight success on most innovations. The Oreo next flavor is the only thing that I can guarantee will be a big splash no matter what it is. But again, that's built on 100+ years of a brand. So in most cases, it's not just thinking your consumer centricity of, what pain point or what tension are you solving for, but all the way to the last mile. How are they shopping for it? How are they going to advocate for you? How are they going to build that product and brand and share the wealth? And that is different. I think putting things on shelf and doing mass media doesn't work for some of the new age stuff. There is a growing of consumer awareness and transparency. Some of it's more fringe in this question of, do I need QR codes to track everything? Some care. Some consumers care, or they care that it was local because local communities and local economies became really important. The ingredient lines and the integrity of how those things are farmed are becoming more and more important. So I think they're just long lead time pieces. And so it's balancing that a bit.
Got it. That's helpful. A question from Denise is like, what skill sets do you encourage your leaders to develop to be successful in an organization like yours, especially as you operate within a larger organization?
I think we're having to retrain some of those skills, to be honest. And back to Jason's question, I don't think I answered on kind of the growth mindset is this ability to generate hypotheses, experiment, learn, to let go of control, to do more with your intuition and less with data. And this is going to sound really trite, but trusting, a lot of big organizations have been built on hierarchy and power and layers. If I need this approval and this approval and this approval, it takes forever. And it starts becoming the telephone game, frankly, of leadership, because then they come back and all those strategic shifts that now you've now Frankensteined your product or bundle. So I think it's encouraging them to be curious, to embrace risk. We are very much around managing risk and mitigating it. So doing things at small scale versus a huge CapEx investment or A&C. So do enough to learn and get the confidence that this is the direction you want to put more behind, and then do the next step. So, and that doesn't have to take a lot of time. It just can be, just rapid fire. I think we just have to get better at being hands-on. That, which is the other piece. I think in big companies, we have become very removed from the marketplace. There's a lot of mechanisms, things you kind of just create it, it just kind of gets rolled out and sold. Go back to the roots, go back to the plant, go back to the store and the consumer, and see what's really happening on the ground is critical.
I feel like you guys have done a really good job of creating that space for leaders to have the autonomy to operate. There's trust from leadership. I imagine not everybody kind of on the Zoom is in that same situation. So
yeah,
whether they're starting from scratch or kind of on that journey, any thoughts or perspective on enablers or things that can help to kind of propel that forward, even if it's just a step in that direction?
I would say if you are a manager, one is check yourself. Where is your risk aversion or level, and what are you willing to let your team do without you being in the room? What decisions are you willing to let them make that you don't need? And then the question is, can you even see if you can take one or two of those items off that, or add to the list that you don't have to be in the room for? So that would be a piece of just checking yourself. Like, am I giving my team the space that their wings can spread? And then if you're a team member and you want to push your manager, I would say figure out where you can contract in certain areas, like discrete things, like kind of, we also have freedom within a framework. Be like, I want to do this project. Like, we're aligned on the strategy. Can I just go run this for the next 2 weeks and then I'll post you or what it is? So, for yourself, figure out those, again, micro experiments of where can you push your leadership to get more comfortable with letting go and building trust. And, I was joking years ago, I had a manager, no matter what I gave her, it did not matter. It came back with red pen all over it. And I was like, at the end of the day, I just, like most people, you're like, whatever I was putting you, it didn't really matter because you're going to rewrite it anyway. And so I started just, doing some basic stuff. And then I got the next manager and we went to submit something. And the response was, okay, go submit it. I'm like, you don't want to read it? I'm like, no, just go submit it. I went through every single number, every single statement. There was not a single thing that I did not have in there that was like, like signed and, and sealed. Because when you own it, you own it. And, what you find is if you create a culture of true ownership and accountability, people most likely will behave that way. No one wakes up wanting to screw up the business and make epic mistakes. They want to do brilliant things and make a difference and an impact. So, that's the piece too. So it's like, where can you chip away?
Oh, this is a good question from Anne here. What's been the area of the most personal growth and realization you've had about your own growth in the past year or so?
In the past year. So being really mindful of things that, I've had lots of different managers, and some are amazing and some not so much. And you always just take like, this is what I will never repeat and how I won't behave, and this is what I want to emulate. And it really, for me, is very much of who are the types of leaders that I want to work for, and what does that mean for me? So making sure I try and walk that talk. I have certain areas where I'm beautiful in conflict, and in others where I'm like, I can do it safely in one space. So I'm trying to work on that. I think it's really trying to embrace who I am as a person, which allows my team to embrace who they are. We are a remote team. The irony is I have people all over the globe, but we're pretty much like a family. And we know what's going on in people's personal lives. We know what's going on in the professional. So I think the buzzword of last year was psychological safety, and making sure that I give that to my team, and for my own self, that I have that as a leader. And then how do I then kind of try and infuse that to the broader organization?
I love it. I've been doing a lot of reflection over just the number of like interviews I've done with these chats over the past few years. And I think the one thing that I appreciate about you, but a lot of the panelists, is just this unapologetic, like passionate curiosity for what's next. And once you start to understand, that drives you to create, to kind of make it happen. And I'm curious, like, for you, like it manifests itself in so many different ways in terms of your passion, you showing up on social, driving you to keep inventing and reinventing and making it better with Codelab and other things. But like, where does that curiosity and drive come from?
You know, lifelong learners. I can blame my father to some extent. You know, you're always learning, and I guess maybe I'll start with that. You're never too old to not learn something new. And if you're not learning and evolving, frankly, I'm worried about you. So it's a piece of the world is changing. And so there's this, maybe that's it. Maybe it's the fear of never wanting to grow up, that I just want to be a little bit aware of what's happening to stay current. But it's also self-improvement, right? You can always keep pushing to be better educated in all sorts of areas, whether it's in history and culture, in food and nutrition, in the sciences. So I think it's just a way of, and if you're not like inspired by that, like figure out what does inspire you. If you're like, you know what, I don't need to learn more, I need to perfect what this is. Great, perfect it, and then figure out how to make it better. Because that's where your innovation is. Like that's where your value will be served, which is, how do you keep making something better with the knowledge base that you have?
One last question for me, and I think we can wrap a little bit early. If you had to go back to the beginning of SnackFutures, like, is there one or a couple things that you kind of would have done differently, or that's the question. Like, if you were to go back to the beginning of SnackFutures, like, what would you have done differently based on what you know now?
I think for myself, I might have put more disciplined guardrails, and not in terms of KPIs of like always numbers, but just trying to know measurement so I could explain the success better and those milestones better. So one of the areas that, so with a lot of innovation hubs, and particularly things were on the front end, is explaining to people who have very old systematic measures of what success is, number sizes, profitability, whatever it is, to tell them when something's working in a completely radical, ambiguous environment. And you don't know, it's like, how could I have given them a framework to be like, yep, when we hit this, like that's a milestone. Like we've been able to retrospectively go back and be like, we created this and this and this and this and this, and I have this awesome checklist. But it's my self-created checklist looking backwards. And I think if I could have done that maybe going forward, so that they could see those milestones going in whatever definition we did, that might have been a valuable piece.
Got it. That's super valuable. It's One last question, and we'll jump, because Anne has another good one, but it was on the tip of my tongue too. Like, in terms of that always learning mentality, like obviously you're learning on trends and kind of what's happening in the food space, but in terms of just kind of startups and innovation in general, like, are there books or resources or experts, or where do you get that inspiration on a regular basis?
I love Seth Godin's blog. I sign up for it daily. It's not always leadership. Sometimes it's just mindset. So it's my one to grow on. Recently, the team, we've become a pseudo startup Bible, which is this ramping your brand, which is helping us because we're moving a little bit from the innovation phase to the incubation to like, now how do you actually grow this business? And again, back to the comment I made is, how do I give the right metrics and KPIs to my management team so that we don't have to keep asking for money, that they know what the path is, even if it's a longer journey. It's just, honestly, all the articles, Inc. has great articles, Fast Company, Fortune, Forbes. I mean, follow people, follow Jason on LinkedIn. Like, you watch other thought leaders and you learn from them and you pick up nuggets there, or take a class that you normally wouldn't. Actually, it was a piece of advice I started giving people was, whether it's in business school or in college, is everyone always takes the classes that they plan to do in their job. And yes, you need some basic level of accounting or finance to have a clue where to start. But if that's all you took, they're going to teach you that on the job in whatever company you're going to do. And you lost this opportunity to take symphony and history and art and, psychology classes. And that's where your brain actually pulls together on. So, read about other industries, because that's where I get inspiration, having that piece, because it will just make you problem solve better versus looking at the same situation and always going back to the same method. It's like, how else can we scrap what we know and refuse. I mean, one of my favorite words is reimagine now. Like, how do we reimagine everything we do? So think of it that way.
I love it. That's a good way to end the convo. Brigette, thank you so much for, I know you're super busy, for taking the time to invest in the Courageous Minds Only community. So I know there's a ton of takeaways. I think to me, just the continuing to stoke creativity and continuing to put the work in to learn and be inspired. I think that's my takeaway. But I think for the audience, I would encourage you to really reflect on what Brigette shared. And I think based on what she shared, I think there's a lot of really good stuff in terms of your own personal development from a leadership standpoint, but also what are some things you can take away from SnackFutures and potentially apply to your brand, to your business. So would encourage you to spend some time reflecting on that. Thanks everybody for joining us. Look out in the coming weeks for an announcement on our next chat, which will happen late summer. And then if you're new to CMO, there's a ton of great recordings at thegaragegroup.com/CMO. This recording, along with snippets from past ones, is up there as well. So keep hustling, keep pushing forward. Thanks for being here. Thanks again, Brigette.
Thank you.